We're pleased that you have tuned into this sermon. It's part of a larger worship experience here at the church, and our prayer is that as you listen, God has a word for you.
So we're currently in a sermon series looking at some of the great stories from the Hebrew Scriptures that inspire and nurture us in faith. And the title of the sermon series is Tell Me a Story. And what I love about that is it reminds us that the Bible that we have only was put down in the form we have it, in written form, really quite late. So when we think about the Hebrew Scriptures in particular, but also a good part of the Christian New Testament, we have to remember that this material existed not in written form for many years, but it was part of an oral tradition. So long before it was written down, these stories and these tales and these accounts and this guidance and all of that material was passed down generation to generation in an oral fashion. And that's how the faith was communicated. And so when we think about the Bible and most definitely the Hebrew Scriptures, we need to keep in mind kind of an image of a group of people in the evening around a fire, and one of the children calling out, "Tell us a story." And then one of the elders stepping forward to tell one of the stories of God's people. And in so doing, to build up and guide the community generation by generation in faith. So that's really what the Hebrew Scriptures are, you see, is this collection of stories. And one story that we can reasonably assume was a real crowd pleaser. I mean, this was a real favorite. This is one that the kids asked for again and again, is the story of David and Goliath. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. And the story of David and Goliath largely centers on three individuals. There's David, and then there's Goliath, and then there's Saul. And we start with David, and he later went on to become the greatest king of Israel. We remember that even to this day, David is considered to be the greatest king that Israel ever had. He's a national hero. But at this point in his life journey, David is a very young man. He's perhaps just out of his teenage years. And he is the youngest son. 8 sons Jesse had, and David is the youngest. And he's the baby. And as part of his function or role in the family business or enterprise, David had responsibility for some of the family flock. And this was where the wealth of the family would have been maintained to a significant degree. So this is a big responsibility. And we can understand from the way that his story is told in the book of 1 Samuel that David was a very good shepherd. He was very skilled with the staff and with the sling, and he was able to drive off very large animals like lions and bears, which came to threaten the flock. David had skill with the sling and the staff to not only drive them off, but also, under necessary circumstances, actually kill them if that had to happen so that the flock would remain safe. David had skill. But on this one particular occasion, we're told, David is sent by his father Jesse to the front lines. He's sent to the front because the army of Israel has been called into action against a Philistine army which has invaded from the north. And they've almost reached Jerusalem. So this is something of a national crisis. And the standing army of Israel was really rather small. But when a national emergency emerged, they would call up citizen soldiers. And 3 of David's older brothers are those citizen soldiers. And not only were you called into service, but your family also had to provision you. So this was why David is sent to the front. He's got to carry provisions for his older brothers and also some goodies for their commanding officer. So Jesse had in mind that he wanted to make sure that base was covered. And when David gets to the front, he can't believe what he sees. He's just stunned because for 40 days, the Philistine army and the army of Israel have been just faced off against each other. They're in the valley of Elah. It's there to this day. And there was a wadi or a dry creek bed that was running between them, and neither army had the advantage. So they're just squared off against each other. And no progress is being made. There's nothing being given, nothing being taken. And the only exception, the only break in this inactivity is a very large individual by the name of Goliath. Maybe you've heard of him. So Goliath is a giant, and we have a few different accounts as to his actual size, but let's say that he's well over 7 feet tall and well in excess of 300 pounds, and he's all muscle. So he could have played center for the Warriors, done really well. And beyond that, Goliath is covered with armor that is bronze, and it's gleaming. It's been burnished so that it reflects the morning light. There's a reason he's going out early in the morning. Sun comes up, and off of his armor is reflected back into the faces of the Israelite army, the sun. And Goliath has a simple proposition. He calls out, any one of you come fight me, and whoever wins that conflict, that army will win, and they'll quit the field, and we'll settle it that way. And this invitation comes every day, as I said, for 40 days. And in those 40 days, do you know how many Israelite soldiers stepped forward to fight Goliath? Any guesses? 0. And David finds this just absolutely inaccessible. This is not going to stand, because the Philistines are where they're not supposed to be. They've invaded the southern kingdom. They are in Judah. God has promised to protect and guide the people and sustain them in the land. And this has to be resisted. And if no one else is going to do it, David volunteers himself, even though he's a little more than a teen. And how do you think his brothers react when he does this? Oh, they laugh. They ridicule him. And then the other soldiers get wind of it, and they start to laugh and ridicule David. But there's one person who actually hears David's offer and decides to take him up on it, and that's King Saul. He's the king at this point. He's kind of fallen out of favor with God a little bit, but he's still the king. And he has tried his darndest for 40 days to try and find someone brave enough, to take on Goliath. He's offered money, fabulous amounts of money. He's offered freedom. He even offered one of his daughter's hand in marriage. Just these were different times, so go with the story. And no takers. But when David volunteers to step forward, Saul approves. And he did this knowing that David didn't have the first chance against Goliath. There's just no way this is going to end well. But maybe Saul thought, I don't know, maybe David would, his sacrifice might inspire someone else who actually had a shot against Goliath. But we can see in Saul's response that he really doesn't have a lot of confidence here. In the 37th verse of 1 Samuel 17, we read, "So Saul said to David, 'Go, and may the Lord be with you.'" Which means something like, "Good luck." But Saul, he's not without a heart. He decides, well, maybe he'll give David some kind of advantage. Not advantage, that's too strong a word. Some kind of help. And that's where we pick up the story. And as I read the story, you're going to notice that there's some difficult and hard things in there, particularly to modern sensibilities. Kind of reminds me of, the news now when we watch it. And they'll often say, well, we're about to show you a video, but we want to warn you in advance that some parts of this video may be difficult to watch. Did you know the Bible kind of needs warnings like that time to time? And this is one of those stories. But I think the violence that's in there does very much serve the purpose of the story that's being told to us. So let's pick it up from 1 Samuel chapter 17. And so Saul clothed David with his own armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. And then David said to Saul, I can't walk with these, for I'm not used to them. So David removed them. And then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi, and he put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Now the Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy, handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Now the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down, and I will cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Now when the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. And there was no sword in David's hand. So what sense can we make of a story like this? What is it wanting to teach us or instruct us? What's the point that this story is seeking to make in our lives? Well, in the Western tradition, for the past several hundred years, the point of this story has largely been interpreted to be that sometimes unequal forces meet, either on a field of battle, or it could be a sporting event, or we can face challenges or difficulties in life that just seem overwhelming. But with a little bit of pluck and determination, sometimes the underdog can win. We still use this story as an illustration of that point, right? Have you ever heard someone refer to a situation that's a David and Goliath situation? You've heard that, right? Well, that's what they're talking about. It's this story. And they're saying we have to remember in life that sometimes smaller, weaker forces or people are going to face challenges or threats or some type of contest that is going to seem to be completely out of reach, but with a little bit of pluck and a little bit of determination, if you hang in there and work hard, sometimes the underdog will prevail. And that's not a bad point, I suppose. It's perhaps a good life lesson. But this story is really driving at so much more than that. We can see it if we look at it a little more closely. This story wants to lift up to us, for instance, how it is we can move in life from fear to courage when we're facing challenges and threats and injustices that are just completely beyond us. It also teaches us the importance of depending on our own gifts and abilities and resources rather than to seek those that are properly suited to someone else. And then finally, it also lifts up the importance of trusting in God, and specifically and particularly during those difficult and hard seasons of life, as hard and as difficult as that can be. First, the importance of moving from fear to courage. And we need to understand that this is the setting of the story when David shows up. The Israelite army, they're in fear. And what's making them afraid? It's Goliath. Again, the armies are very equally matched. That's why they're faced off against each other for these 40 days. But they are terrified. They are filled with fear because of Goliath. He is so massive. He is so huge. He is so threatening. That's all they can see. And how true it is in life when you and I focus on a threat or a challenge or some injustice or something that we're confronting that just, is right there in front of us, we can lose sight of everything else, right? We can just lose sight of everything else. That's what's happened to the Israelite army. And David had the ability to frame Goliath in a larger understanding or perspective. David remembered that it was God who had promised this land to them. And God had promised to protect them and preserve them in the land, even in the face of this invading army. And so that gave David a larger perspective. He wasn't just focused on the threat that Goliath represented, but he was also aware of the larger promise of God's fidelity. And that was the larger framework in which he evaluated the threat that Goliath actually represented. From there, we can see that David trusted in his own gifts and abilities and resources and not those that belonged to someone else. And in case you were wondering, in the story, and particularly when they told it around like campfire at night, when one of the elders was telling the story of David and Goliath to the kids and the community, the point of the story where everyone would start laughing is the point where Saul is trying to put his armor on David. Because Hebrew humor at this time was very visual. That's how you can tell when you read particularly the Hebrew scriptures, but also the New Testament. That's how you can tell humor is coming in, is when you're confronted with a situation that when you try to imagine it in your mind's eye, just looks silly. So here you've got a teen, and he's taken on this immense responsibility of facing down a giant Goliath in battle, and Saul's best solution is to do what? Bring out his own armor and put it on a boy, and drag out his massive sword and put it in his hand. So do you have that visual image in your mind? It's kind of silly, isn't it? Because David had never worn armor before. He'd never swung a sword. Those weren't his tools and his implements. David was a shepherd. And this is how we can see David was really not only brave, but he was also very clever. Because while the rest of the Israelite army was looking at Goliath and seeing this massive threat that none of them felt they could overcome, David remembered taking on those lions and bears with a sling. And he said, what I see here is a massive, slow-moving target with an exposed forehead. That's what David saw. And so David went out and chose 5 smooth stones. And trust me, he chose those very, very carefully. And that's also why in the story, you may have noticed that the action of the actual battle between David and Goliath is very brief. In fact, it's only 1 verse. The entire 17th chapter of 1 Samuel deals with this story of David and Goliath, but the actual battle between the two of them, 1 verse. David runs, he gets set, he puts a stone in his sling, and he takes Goliath down. That's all it takes. Because he used the resources and the abilities and the gifts that were suitable for him. And however well-intentioned Saul might have been, Saul's armor and sword were not for David. And that's why the last verse of the reading is, and David had no sword in his hand. That wasn't his implement. Sometimes we can think that we're helping someone else. We can think that we're giving them a resource to face a challenge or a threat or some type of situation that they're dealing with, and how easy it is for us to run in and offer advice and resources and help that are suitable to us and not for the other person. David resisted that, went with his own gifts and abilities. And then the final thing we can see is that David trusted in God and under the most difficult of circumstances. And David's trust in God actually comes out in a very interesting way in the passage that I read for us. It comes out in some trash talk between Goliath and David. You may have noticed that in the reading. So, we all watch sporting events, right? And we see the athletes trash talking one another, and we wonder where that comes from. You may have wondered, when did that start? Well, maybe our story today. Because when David takes the field, Goliath looks at him and says, "What am I, a dog that you're coming at me with sticks?" Meaning, are you playing with me? Is this all you got? And then he starts to curse David by his own gods. But David's having none of it. He calls back, "You're not where you belong. You're invading. And just to show you that there's a God in Israel, I'm going to wipe the field with you." And that's exactly what he does. So I think we look at this story and we can see, there is a lesson there about just sticking with a difficult situation or being faithful in the face of a threat, because sometimes the weaker force, the little guy, does actually prevail. But there's so much more going on than that. There's an invitation here for us to move beyond fear to courage. When we are confronted by situations in life that are just beyond us, we don't know what to do. There are threats that just seem overwhelming, or injustices, and we simply don't know where to turn. We can put them in perspective by remembering God's promises to be faithful to us and to be with us, whatever life throws at us. And when it comes to meeting those threats and those challenges, to use the gifts and the resources and the abilities that are available to us. And in case you were wondering, the point of this story is not to go out and buy a sling. Let me be very clear about that. The point of this story is not go out and buy a sling to face the challenges that come against you, right? Because if you try to use a sling, I can guarantee you're going to hurt yourself far more than anyone else. And it usually works that way. No, the wonderful thing about being Jesus followers is we've been given a very different set of tools to use as we face the challenges that come to us in life. And it doesn't involve violence and hurting other people, but it's a very different kind of equipage that we are armed and that we are armored with. The Apostle Paul drives at this in Ephesians 6. He writes, "Stand therefore and fasten the belt of truth around your waist and put on the breastplate of righteousness and shoes for your feet. Put on whatever will make you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. With all of these, take the shield of faith with which you will be able to quench all the flaming arrows of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God." You and I are sent out to face challenges and difficulties in life armed with things like truth, like righteousness, meaning a deep commitment to social cohesion and fairness, to be peacemakers, to depend upon God's Spirit to be active in front of us, to lead with faith and with love. Those are the kinds of resources that we're called to use to not only meet those challenges, but also to change the world. And it's in doing that we learn to trust in God. Trusting in God comes as we learn to depend on those gifts and abilities and resources that God in Christ has made available to us. When I think about the story of David and Goliath in this way, I found myself thinking of so many of you who've shared stories with me over the years of challenges or difficulties or things you've faced that seem absolutely overwhelming and you didn't know where to turn, but then God showed up. And you found a way with God's help to not become absolutely focused on that threat that was right in front of you, but to put it in a larger context. And then to realize that you've been given great resources by God in order to meet those challenges and threats. And that in trusting God, as difficult and as hard as that is and can be, amazing things can happen. And I also think of giants, leaders in the church who've had that experience, and I'll close with this. I thought of a famous story from the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we forget this because he was such a champion for civil rights and absolutely changed the landscape of race relations in this country. But did you know there was a point in his ministry when he almost gave up? I mean, think about what would have happened if he had given into that temptation to just give up. It was early on in his ministry. It was 1956. White supremacists were coming at him professionally with the work that he was trying to do, but they were also personally attacking him and threatening his safety and also that of his family. And this was just relentless. And so in his kitchen, he sat down, put his head in his hands, and he said, I don't have it. I can't do this. I'm at the end of my rope. I'm afraid. He was mobilized. And it was then something remarkable happened. He wrote the following. At that moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced God before. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever. And almost at once, my fears began to go. my uncertainty disappeared, and I was ready to face anything. That's what God can do. And I think David would most heartily agree. Amen.
We invite you to get to know our community better. You can do that by exploring our YouTube channel, and do hit subscribe and check notifications so we can send you any future updates. You can also explore our community of faith at the church website, lopc.org, and we hope you know there's always a place for you here.